All right, guys. Last little video about kind of things leading up to America during World War II. The next sections we're going to cover are kind of the challenges faced at home, but this is kind of us getting into the war. All right, so like I said before, you'll need a graphic organizer about early U.S. involvement slash entry. This shouldn't take very long. All right, so a couple things. I've got American involvement broken into two parts, kind of pre-war stuff. As we can see from what it says on the chart, right? America had basically declared neutrality for 3 straight years. Now, keep in mind, the war doesn't actually start until 1939. It's just kind of fascinating as that the U.S. was just basically like, nope, we're not doing anything. Now, really, this was directed at countries like Japan. That's what this is really directed at. They had been, we'll talk more about it in a second, aggressively been adding territory in Asia, and so they just were like, we're not selling you weapons anymore. And I think a lot of it has to do with, the memories of World War One. We saw the U.S. get pulled into a war they didn't want to be part of. We saw the U.S. retreat in the 1920s. I think it's all just a continuation of that ideology we saw from World War One. All right, now when the war actually starts, like we said, in 39, the war will begin when essentially Germany invades Poland. Now, again, I think that the memory of World War One looms large for the United States. And so we have the Neutrality Act of 1939, also known as the cash and carry policy. So what we basically did was said we will be more than happy to sell weapons. All right. But two things. One, you pay cash, no credit, no loans, cash. So why? Well, because here's the thing. We definitely didn't want to be in a position where we were owed money by somebody. We kind of saw this happen during World War One, and we weren't willing to do it again. Now, who are we selling weapons to? Let's be honest here. It was literally like a 8-to-1, 9-to-1 ratio. We are not selling weapons to Germany. We're not selling weapons to Japan. We're selling weapons to our friends, basically England, France, and the other major allies. Now, let's take a second to talk about the carry side of this, right? Cash, I think, makes sense. It's like you want my money. All right. Carries this too. Remember, if we go back to World War one of the big things that dragged us into the war was this issue of unrestricted submarine warfare. All right, the famous example we talked about was the Lusitania. That wasn't the only one. The German U-boats were sinking American vessels. So what's our solution to this problem? If you want it, you come here with your boats and you take it out of here. That way we can avoid any of these potential problems like we saw during World War One in the Lusitania. All right, so we're neutral, but not really. How do we know we're really, really not neutral? Well, FDR is going to give a pretty famous speech called the Arsenal of Democracy speech in December of 39. So at this point, the war has already started. It has been going on for a few months. And basically, he says, we as the United States have a duty and a requirement to essentially arm the world against the Nazis. I don't think he actually uses the refer to them as the Nazis, but he says like tyranny and oppression and things of that nature. So like, yeah, he's not saying Nazis per se, but everyone's like, I know you're talking about the Nazis. Essentially, they want to conquer the world, and we, as the United States, can play a very vital role in preventing that from ever happening. All right, part two. I know here's the thing. As if you watched the last video, you know this that the our allied friends are in serious trouble. France is gone. England is being bombarded by the Germans, and we're just begging and hoping they can hold on. All right. Also, one of the other things that's going to happen shortly after this is um, Germany's going to do something stupid. All right. So, like we said before, they had the non aggression pact with Russia. Germany is going to violate that agreement. So, what does that mean? It means that Germany is going to invade Russia. They're going to try to take out the Russians. Now, why are they doing all this? So, a couple of things. One, um, they need access to oil. There's lots of oil in the Soviet Union and Russia. Two, southern Russia, the Ukraine, essentially has this region that is very good for agriculture. The Ukraine is kind of like was the breadbasket of Russia. And then the last one is, let's be honest here, Russia had a pretty substantial Jewish population, and Hitler was in the process of beginning the final solution, aka the Holocaust. So Russia had some value to him. So he invades Russia. Also, keep in mind that at this point, when he's invading Russia, he's essentially the only one left in Europe who's really fighting him are the British. He's essentially dealt with everybody else. Now he can take his attention. That does not go well. We'll talk about that later. All right. Out of the Lend-Lease Act, which is here's what basically what they're doing. The English are in serious trouble. They don't have any more money. They are running out of supplies. And we know if they get beaten by the Germans, that we're next, right? They're going to come for us, and we cannot see England collapse. So, what we start to do is start to lend them and lease them weapons. I think you're smart enough to know what's going to happen here. I'm going to lease you a tank. Do you think a tank's going to come back in good shape? Probably not. So, really, the Lend Lease Act was us just making their weapons for them and sending them off. Oh yeah, we'll get paid back eventually. We were never going to get paid back. This is just a way to keep sending them stuff they needed. Um, One of those things was called the Atlantic Charter. Basically, it was an agreement between Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, because Neville Chamberlain got voted out of office, and FDR, who basically said FDR is like they met in the North Atlantic off the coast of Canada, and they basically said, whatever you need, I got you, bro. You're good. All right. So we keep marching further ahead here, right? We're now getting closer to um, the event that's actually going to pull us into the war. Technically, for freedom of speech came before the Lend Lease Act. It was kind of like a opening salvo. So FDR is giving the forced freedom speech, was essentially the State of the Union in 41. And here's basically says that all people of the world have the right to be free and have their speech, the right to have speech, the right to worship as they want, free of want and free of fear. These are all things that all people should want. Here's the thing, America at the time is not really interested in going to war. And what FDR keeps having to do is just kind of keep pushing the idea out there like, this isn't just a fight for us, this is a fight for the world. This isn't World War One, right? We can argue that was a European fight. This fight is so much bigger than that. And so he keeps having to give these speeches to try to make sure the American people understand why we're doing what we're doing. In fact, we're going to have a peacetime draft around this time. So we're not even at war yet. And FDR is like, let's start getting ready. So here's the thing. It's so obvious we're going to be in this fight eventually. FDR knows it. Everyone in the government knows it. I think people probably knew it too. But until the people are 100% behind him or mostly behind him, he can't move forward. Now, what is important about the For Freedom speech, besides being famous, is that it also kind of outlines maybe more of that post-war stuff we talk about specifically. A lot of things that these things that everyone has the rights to that he says kind of become the hallmark of the United Nations. So connections here. Let's make one really quickly. Jot it down. All right. Think of Wilson's 14 points in the fourth freedom speech, kind of in the same ballpark, not exactly. All right, Wilson's 14 points was about what the peace process would look like when that war ended. FDR is more talking about what the world should look like when it's all over. Not exactly the same, but I can see some reasonable connections there. Now, here's the problem. FDR has got a relatively strong isolationist or anti-war movement in the United States. Again, we saw that in World War One as well. The group we want to know is the America First Committee. All right, so they're going to oppose our involvement in World War II, really in any way, shape, or form. They don't want us involved in it at all. And their argument is we suffered massive losses in World War One, which we did. I think it was about 130,000 people or so. So that's a pretty big number. All right. Compared to the rest of the world, not as much. But still, that's a big number for war we didn't want any part of to begin with. Their argument is this, right? Okay. Um, they don't think England's going to win. They think England's going to lose. And therefore, why continue to feed them stuff if they're just going to lose? So, what should we do instead? We should make sure that we are protected, that this hemisphere, the United States, is well protected. So, they're not talking about not building up the military, they're not talking about not preparing for something. They would rather see us prepared in case we got attacked. All right. That makes a certain amount of sense. But the reality is, unless somebody steps up and stops Hitler, it doesn't probably matter much, does it? Now, I mentioned him before when we watched that video in the 1920s, Charles Lindbergh. He was probably one of the most famous people in America, one of the most respected people in America. He was that crazy daredevil pilot who managed to fly across the Atlantic in, I think, was a whopping 36 hours. But anyway, he's this huge iconic figure. I mentioned that wasn't in the video we watched in the 1920s that his baby got kidnapped. That was this huge national, international story that everyone had sympathy for him. So Charles Lindbergh becomes the face and lead spokesperson for the America First Committee. All right. He goes around the United States saying the English aren't going to win, which makes the English feel real good. All right. He also gets viewed as a Nazi sympathizer. Why? As I think I talked about before, during the run up to the war, uh, Lindbergh will go and visit with Hitler. He'll go and inspect his Air Force. He'll go and get receive this Medal of Honor kind of thing from Hitler for his aviation accomplishments. All these crazy things. So here's the thing: it makes him look really, really bad. And then the other thing that makes Charles Lindbergh look really, really bad was he was anti-Semitic. But here's the sadly enough, everyone in America pretty much was. No one was really like, super friendly to the Jewish community, no matter who you were or where you're from. So here's the thing: Charles Lindbergh becomes his face, the face, the face. What's going to wind up happening is obviously we're going to get pulled into the war, and when we get pulled into the war, Charles Lindbergh becomes this kind of pariah. This once grand hero is suddenly no one wants to deal with him, no one trusts him, no one likes him, and he's kind of forced to kind of suffer away the rest of his life in infamy. So, what kind of things does the America First Committee do? They oppose the Lend Lease Act. Um, they basically hold speeches. They have pamphlets. They do radio broadcasts. They're doing everything they can to convince the American people. And they were pretty large. 800,000 people is not nothing. That's just, and there's probably several million people who agreed with them. So a minority, but a pretty vocal minority at that. Now, all this is going to come to a crashing halt. Like this idea of isolationism and staying out of the war is going to come to, and then when Germany decides to invade Russia, but more importantly, when they decide to attack Pearl Harbor. All right, so this is the last thing we want to cover real quick. Um, so Pearl Harbor, entry into the war. So let's talk a little bit about Japan. If we're looking at this map up here really quickly, this is actually really just Japan proper right here, right? If we're talking about the true Japanese islands. All right. All the rest of this is what they'll control by 1942. So one of the things that worth noting here is Japan had been on an incredibly aggressive expansion streak. Since they began to modernize in the very late parts of the 19th century, they have been looking to acquire land. They took places in China, Vietnam, Korea, and you can see places all the way down here in the Philippines, New Guinea, all these places. They're going to take all of them eventually. Why are they doing all this? Because Japan has limited resources on their island and they need more. And also the people had been kind of brainwashed. There was this cult of personality around the emperor that basically made them out to be like a warrior culture that needs to do stuff. So why do they care about us? Well, FDR gives this thing called the quarantine speech. That basically we need to quarantine Japan. What does that mean? One, cut off oil supplies. You are basically an island nation. You kind of need oil to get your navy and your supplies moving around the region, right? Any assets they had in the United States were frozen. They had quite a bit. So the idea was we would basically try to undermine their economic engine in the hopes of ending their pursuits. All we did was antagonize them. And so what will happen is the famous thing we got to know is the attack on Pearl Harbor happens on December 7th, 1941. The reality is this: Pearl Harbor was significant strategically for the United States, and because one, it was our kind of like we talked about the way station on the way to Asia, but more importantly, it held a large percentage of our Pacific fleet. So on a Sunday morning in Hawaii, which was this kind of like party station for the U.S. Navy and military, they attacked on a Sunday morning very early, so everyone was asleep and hungover. They never declared war; they just attacked without warning. The hope was that they would slow down the U.S. military and then they could be more expansive, which is how they managed to get all of this stuff down here. We had control of the Philippines, but we were forced to abandon it because we no longer could hold it because we just didn't have the resources anymore. So the results here, right? Obviously, the U.S. is going to be angry. FDR is going to give a very famous speech called Day of Infamy speech. He declares war on the Japanese. Now, here's the thing: we declare war on Japan, not Germany. Germany, a few days later, is going to turn around and declare war on us. So now everybody's in the pool. Everyone's fighting. In terms of the results, you can see the numbers here: 2,400 people killed, 8 battleships destroyed, 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 200 planes all wiped out. Now, the thing is this: FDR said in a speech, they awoke a sleeping giant. So America is now going to spring into action. Our manufacturing base, which was already large and untouched because during this war, is now going to begin to basically step it up even more and really begin to push the war effort. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next video about life at home.